We've got our Module 4 case study video. I'm going to keep it as a very short one because I know we had a pretty long video lecture this week. It's basically going to provide you some background leading into the assignment that you have for the end of this module. So we're going to talk about how the US came about clearing the southern United States, dispossessing Native Americans of territory. And we're going to see how this connects to Andrew Jackson, who we saw in the video lecture, as well as it connects to themes going forward. So it's useful for us to have a sense of what the Native American Southeast looked like in the 18 teens and 20s. And so you can see here that there are 5 major Native American powers that control much of the region. The Seminole in what is today Florida, the Creek in what is today Florida, Georgia and Alabama, the Cherokee in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee and so on, and then the Chickasaw in sort of Tennessee, Mississippi, and the Choctaw in Mississippi into Alabama. These 5 groups had significant power and were widely known by people throughout the United States. By 1860, some 40 years or so later, the United States would have turned pretty much all of the region occupied by these 5 groups into cotton plantation territory. And so the US, as the economic value of cotton and the centrality of the institution of slavery increased, increasingly became desperate to push these Native American powers off of their land. By the 18 teens, what the government called Indian removal, that is pushing Native American powers east of the Mississippi River, so between the Mississippi and the Atlantic Ocean, off their land west of the Mississippi River, was official federal policy. It was to be done initially through small amounts of funds that Congress dedicated for this purpose. And eventually, Congress and the president would abandon the coercive financial approach to go to a more direct approach of violence. By the 1820s, the state of Georgia was putting a lot of pressure on the federal government to force Cherokee Nation off of their territory in Georgia. They were doing this because white Georgians wanted to take land the Cherokee controlled for themselves, largely for cotton plantations, but for other purposes as well. The pressure increased even more when gold was discovered in Cherokee territory, and white Georgians pushed to have access to it. Georgia even went so far, as pictured in this later drawing, to hold a land lottery and actually tell white Georgians they had claim to Cherokee territory, even as the Cherokee still controlled it. In 1830, when Andrew Jackson is president, the US Congress passes what's called the Indian Removal Act, which gives the president more power to pursue removal of indigenous powers from east of the Mississippi to west of the Mississippi. And for the next 8 years, that'll be a major focus of the US government. And the one example we're going to talk more about in the next few minutes, and will be a focus of your assignment, is Cherokee Nation. Pictured here is Sequoyah, the inventor of the Cherokee alphabet. And in many ways, many white Americans saw the Cherokee as the most American of indigenous peoples in US territory, because they had a written language, they had constitution and laws that were relatively similar to those of the United States. They practiced slavery. They practiced fixed agriculture, and they had a lot of things that made people in the US see them as more assimilated or more like US citizens. But this really ended up providing Cherokee Nation with almost no protection from the predations of white Georgians seeking to take their land. For years leading up to the mid-1830s, Cherokee Nation signed a series of treaties giving up tens of thousands of acres of land, hundreds of thousands of acres of land actually, to the US and to Georgia. But it was never enough. And eventually Cherokee Nation decided to draw a line and stop conceding land. At this point, Georgia declares that they're suspending the Cherokee Constitution and that the Cherokee will no longer be governed by their own laws as stipulated by the Constitution, but instead would be subject to the laws of Georgia. When this happens, Cherokee Nation takes their case through the US court system all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court, in a case called Worcester v. Georgia, declares that the laws of Georgia can have no force on Cherokee territory, and that the Cherokee Nation can only give up their land by doing so voluntarily, that the United States and the state of Georgia cannot make a law to seize Cherokee territory. However, the president at the time, 1832, is Andrew Jackson, who has a long history of ignoring the law and the Constitution. And Jackson does so in this case. There's an apocryphal phrase, meaning a phrase that's widely attributed to Jackson, but that he probably never said, called John Marshall, that says, John Marshall, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time, has made his ruling, now let him enforce it, referring to the fact that the court had no army. Well, he didn't say that. He said a more roundabout version of it. Jackson essentially ignores the ruling of the Supreme Court and proceeds to push the Cherokee to move out of their territory. Eventually, this process culminates in Jackson's apprentice and successor as president, Martin Van Buren, rounding up, requiring the U.S. Army to place Cherokee citizens who still remain in Georgia, in this territory, in concentration camps, before marching them, sometimes literally at the point of a bayonet, west to what was referred to at the time as Indian Territory. Some 15 to 20,000 citizens of Cherokee Nation were put in concentration camps and endured this forced march, which is often referred to as the Trail of Tears. Historians' estimates suggest that somewhere around 1 out of every 4 Cherokee citizens forced to make this march died, with somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 individuals dying of starvation at the hands of the US Army and so on. And I've focused on the Cherokee. The Cherokee are the last group that holds out. But before this, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole have been forced off their land or forced to make treaties. This happens in the North as well, with indigenous powers like the Foxes and others. And all in all, in the early 1800s, something in the order of 100,000 indigenous people are forced off their land to territories west of the Mississippi River against their wishes, and also against the ruling of the US Supreme Court. And here you can see a more detailed map showing dates specifically of removal, with the Cherokee forced between sort of 1835 and 1838, and other groups earlier. And you can see also the territories that the US Army forced them to. So for your assignment for this module, you're going to focus on 2 documents, one from Andrew Jackson and one from John Ross, who's the principal chief, the leader of Cherokee Nation. And you're going to be kind of looking at their different approaches and kind of how things have changed between their 2 statements. and the extent to which what Andrew Jackson states before removal actually happens based on John Ross's letter as it's happening. So I'm going to keep this one brief, as I said. The video lecture for this week was quite long, so I want to keep this one short. I do encourage you to continue staying in touch with me and sending emails. We can meet via Zoom or anything if you have any questions. I think for most of you, things are going quite well so far in the course, but do please let me know if at any point you do want to meet. All right, well, I'll see you in Module 5.